Yeah. All right. Well, first of all, thanks, Nikhil, for having me on the channel. I'm going to talk about Happy Soup, which is a free open source project that allows for impact and dependency analysis in Salesforce. And so let's just jump right into it. So exactly what is it? So like I said, it's an open source project. It's built on JavaScript and Node.js. I'll show the link to the GitHub repository later so everyone can see it if they want. And it's a tool that allows admins and developers to understand the dependencies in their org. And I'm going to explain later what are some of the use cases where this is important and why you should understand the dependencies in your org. And it also allows for impact analysis. And basically, impact analysis is about understanding the implications, well, the impact of the changes that you make in your Salesforce org. And then we're going to look at dependency analysis, which is actually very similar to impact analysis, but there's a few differences on why you would want to do that.
Yeah.
So let's go over some use cases on impact analysis. I think the most common one and the one that people can familiarize themselves the most is about changes to a custom field. So let's say that you have a pick list field with 3 values, and you're going to rename one of those existing values from X to Z, right? So when you do that in Salesforce, there's a lot of things that could break because there's a lot of different customizations that could be relying on the presence of that value, right? So for example, report filters. Maybe you have a report that says, show me the records where this field equals X. But if you change X to Z, then that filter no longer makes sense. For example, as well, Apex classes or even JavaScript controllers in Lightning Web Components that use this value for some if-else logic. If you remove that value and in the future that value doesn't exist, then you're essentially only having one branch and you're missing one entire branch of the logic, right?
Yeah.
Same with workflow rules. If your workflow rules that use a field for criteria, that could also break. And I'm saying here, etc., because there's literally so many things in Salesforce that can reference custom fields because they are an essential part of the application or the platform, right? So the important thing here to understand is that when you make changes to a field, as simple as that seems, just a few clicks, in big orgs, that could actually have a huge impact. You could end up breaking a lot of features. And that's what we're going to see later on.
So basically, Happy Soup is like highlighting in the starting itself, okay, check your dependency, whether it's going to break or something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Like
so
before changing, you can come directly to Happy Soup, figure out your field. Okay, does it has any dependency? Will it break something or not?
That's
and
exactly
it will highlight, right? It will not stop, but it will give you an indication this may break. That's it, right?
Exactly, yeah. So to give you an example, what we have used in the company that I work for is we have used a dependency analysis template as part of our done definition of a story. So meaning if you have a story of, do X, Y configuration, do you understand the impact? What are the implications of making this change? So what we do is before we start that feature, we run some few components through Happy Soup so that we understand where are these components used and make a decision of, will my change break these configurations? And if it does, then obviously they need to do more work. You need to figure out, okay, how do I change this other configuration so that it doesn't break or so that it's agnostic to the change that I'm doing? But yes, you're correct. The idea is that you use it before that you make the changes so that you can make informed decisions as to what those changes should be.
Yeah, it's pretty important nowadays too. It breaks a lot of things. Yeah, it's a pretty cool feature.
Yeah. Great. Then another use case for dependency analysis or impact analysis is many people in the Salesforce ecosystem are actually independent consultants. And what that means is they'll just go to a company and do something for 3 months and then jump to the next contract. So every time you start in a new company, you literally know nothing about the configuration of that org. You don't know the metadata, you don't know which objects they use, you don't know how many people have put configuration there. So you could use Happy Soup to understand where things are used. And I'll give an example of this where actually Happy Soup can tell you at a high level how is a specific object used. So if you wanted to understand how is the opportunity object used in this company, how do they use it, HappySoup can tell you some of that, not everything, but it can give you a pretty good idea. And another use case for an independent consultant is that if you're asked to work on a component, maybe a Visualforce page, an Apex class, and you don't know what that component depends on to function, right? Of course, that component doesn't live in isolation, probably depends on other fields, other classes, etc. So we'll see later on how you can actually use HappySoup to understand what something depends on, just so that you have a greater idea of everything that's involved in the piece of work that you're doing.
Okay.
And the final use case is about page layout optimization, which I think it's also very common, especially now with Lightning, that you have so many features for making fields dependent or sections of the page layout dependent. It's very
Right.
important to remove clutter from the page layouts. And sometimes I've seen page layouts that have so many fields. And so it's actually hard to get the business to sit with you and go through field by field and understand, is it used, is it relevant, is it important, is it maybe a duplicated field. So there's a feature of HappySoup that allows you to export all the fields of a page layout to an Excel sheet in literally one click. And then the idea is you can take that sheet and look at it with your business analysts or with your business users and understand, okay, let's decide which fields are relevant or not. So those are at a high level some of the use cases for
So
HappySoup.
for page layout optimization, it's more of it's giving you all the fields to us in the Excel format, and then we can, based on that, figure out, okay, these are the fields we are required. Then based on the Excel sheet, we go to the page layout and do the customization directly.
Yeah,
This is the
exactly.
idea.
So
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's just an easy way of not having to always go to the page layout to show someone the fields that are being used. You can export them in one go, and then you can share that file with anyone, right? So it's an easy way of knowing which fields are on a page layout.
Exactly.
So
That makes sense. Even business people don't aware of the design of the Salesforce dashboard. They understand Excel better than the
yeah,
configuration. So it's easy for
exactly.
them. That's a pretty cool. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let me picture speaks 1,000 words, right? So let me show what it actually looks like. The first thing is I'm just going to show that this is the open source project. There's a lot of information there on sort of the motivation for HappySoup and some of the features that I've discussed. There's loads of data there, so I encourage people to actually go there and read a bit more of the behind the scenes of how HappySoup works. But as you can see, it's an open source project. All the code is there. Anyone can see what it does, how it does it. And I think this is especially important for people that may have security concerns, right? Like, who's this? What is this app, right? How is it using my data? And that is a 100% valid concern. And so the idea is that being an open source project, everyone can see exactly how the data is used, and and if they have concerns with that, they could just run this app on their own computer. And I also give the option to deploy to Heroku in one button, so that's not another alternative. If you don't want to use HappySoup but you do want to use the features, you
Yeah.
have the option to run it in your own local environment. And it's pretty easy, and there's a lot of documentation there on how that works.
Yeah.
Cool. So going to HappySoup, the website is very simple. It's happysoup.io. And you can log in essentially with three different login types. You can log into a production org, a sandbox, or with a specific my domain. In this case, oops, sorry about that. In this case, earlier I logged in with one of my previous Trailhead orgs. So HappySoup actually remembers the last domain that I used. So I'm just gonna log in with that.
Pablo, can you zoom it a little bit? It's
Yeah,
pretty small right now.
yeah, actually, let me zoom it down completely. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Cool, I'm just gonna keep it like that. Okay, so as you can see, the UI is pretty minimalist. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. It's very straightforward. So the first thing you do is you select one metadata type, fields, buttons, objects, page layouts that you want to do something with. And this something is either dependency analysis or where it's being used, etc. So I'm
Yeah.
going to show the most basic example, which is where is a custom field used, which is the first topic that we were discussing earlier. So when you click this, we pull some of the fields from your org, and then you can just use autocomplete here to specify one field. So in this case, I'm going to pull the customer priority field from the account.
Yeah.
And I have two options. I can see where is this used, which is the impact analysis, or I can see if there are any fields referenced by this field. And what this means is that if this field was a formula field, a formula field can reference other fields, right? Even up to
Yeah.
10 fields. This second option would actually show me what are those fields that this formula depends on. I'm not going to show this example right now, but I'm going to come back to the deployment boundary example later.
Yeah.
So let's just say, okay, where is this used? So you just click here on search. It takes a few seconds analyzing your dependencies. And as you can see, we immediately show you a nice looking chart so that you can immediately tell what is the most impacted metadata type, or what is the metadata type that uses this custom field the most. And so in this case, we can see that it's workflow rules. Now, obviously, this is a small number, it's just 5. But if I were to run this in a real org, you're most likely going to see a significantly higher number,
Yes.
especially on reports. You would see that the field is probably used in 100 different reports. Um, but the idea of this chart is like I said, you immediately know that the answer to that question. What is the most impacted area? You don't need to even think about it. You don't need to count the data here. You just know that it's 5 workflow rules. Now, the specifics of which metadata types or components are used in this field are here. So you just need to scroll down and they are sorted by their metadata type. So for example, if I open this up layout, this is essentially telling me that these 4-page layouts are referenced in this field. And the same with workflow field updates and workflow rules, and even in reports. So there are 3 reports that are used in this field. So this is like you said earlier, this is what you would do first, right? You get asked to make a change in a field, and before you actually go and run and make that change, you just come to HappySoup and you do it in 5 seconds. You run this query, and you know, oh well, if I change this thing, I need to make sure that none of these metadata types heavily rely on that value or whatever it is you're going to change, right? And then
Right.
you can make again an informed decision as to what you should do with that change. Um, one of the nice features when it comes to Apex classes is that Apex code, or like any programming language, can actually read data off of a field or variable, or it can actually insert data into that field. So when I
Correct.
was building HappySoup, I realized that it was important to know that a field is used in a class, but it's actually more important to know how it's used because of what I was saying earlier. If there's a class that has some if-else logic, depending on a specific value of this pick list, and you're going to remove it, then you're going to have some dead code, some code that is never going to be, called because
Execute.
that
Yeah.
is never going to execute. So you, by showing here that this is a read, I guess, expression, then you know that this Apex class is possibly doing some sort of either SOQL query or an if else or something that is actually reading data of this field to do something, right? So you should check what that is. And then the opposite is that maybe the class is actually inserting data into that field, which is not that critical, but I think it's useful, for example, if say there's a pick list field that has certain value in
Right.
a record and you don't know how did this value ended up here, like nobody put it manually, we don't have any workflow rules that put this value, we don't have any integrations that put this data into this field, there must be some other automation that is actually inserting this data into this field. So again, just by knowing here that this class writes data into that field, that's a potential candidate that you should investigate and see if that's the culprit.
No, yeah, it's pretty good actually. Otherwise, we have to do the global search in VS Code, figure out
Yeah.
okay where we are using, and it's very time consuming in that way. It's pretty cool feature, yeah.
Yeah. Now, similarly, when it comes to reports, and this actually came from an idea on the idea exchange that somebody mentioned it. I never thought about it when I initially built HappySoup. Is that okay? I know that a field is used in these 3 reports, but how is it used? Is it actually just like a column on the report? Is it a filter? Are we filtering by that field? Or are we actually grouping by that field? And that's actually all important because, like I said earlier, if it's a filter is the same as an if condition, right? It's just in a report. If you remove that value, that filter no longer makes sense and your report will just not display the data that people are expecting. So by default, Happy Soup doesn't show you that. But if you scroll up here and you choose your toppings, which obviously it's kind of like a joke when you're choosing toppings for a pizza.
Yeah.
So if you go here to choose your toppings, there are a few more options that you can select when it comes to custom fields. Now, this one here is a bit advanced, and I'm not going to actually explain what that is, but the first one is what I was just talking about, that this option allows you to see how the field is used in those reports. This is only available for the first 100 reports. That's because in big orgs, if the field is used in like 400 reports, it would actually be too expensive to make that many API calls to the Salesforce API to get the data. And I think if you have more than 100 reports, you have a different problem, right? Like, so anyway, let me take that box and let's just do it again and we'll see what it does. As you can see, it's going to take a bit longer, but
Yeah.
not much. Now, if we go back here to reports, it's very similar to the Apex class logic earlier. And essentially it's telling me that this first report is actually using the field in two ways. It's using it as a grouping, and it's also using it as a filter. And this sentence here, it's the actual filter. So you don't even need to click on the report to see what the filter is. We immediately tell you that this report says, show me accounts where the customer priority equals low. And if you want to
Right.
confirm, you can just click on it and you'll see that that's actually what it does. You can see right there.
Yeah.
So it's pretty nice because you don't need to go click on the report and see, one by one. And again, if the field is being used in multiple ways, like in this case, a grouping and a filter, HappySoup will tell you. The second scenario is where the field is just a column. So the impact is less. It's okay if the field changes because it's just a column, it's just a visualization. And the third impact or category here is that unfortunately reports can be in private folders. So it is possible for a user to create a private folder for themselves and have a report in it. So HappySoup can initially pull that report, but when it comes to actually seeing the details of that report to see if the field is used as a filter, we can't. And that's just a Salesforce limitation. But
Yeah.
rather than showing nothing, at least I'm telling you here that, we can't tell you because it's a private report. And that may actually be a good piece of information to have because if you have 100 private reports, then you have a big change management problem because suddenly you have maybe more than 100 people with their own reports and you don't know how they're going to break,
Right.
right? So any questions on this so
Yeah,
far?
yeah, I have like, so you said like while I'm going for this grouping scenario in the filtering or for like analysis, you can consume only 100 calls at a time, right? Like maximum you are, otherwise it will be an expensive job for us, right? So
Yeah,
are you using the Salesforce Open API? Like you can hit as many API or they have some limitation? Like in Google Maps are open source, right? And but if I go with the free license, basically with that API, they will gives us like thousands calls per day,
right.
right? So do we have any limitation around that? Like in a
So
org?
yes and yeah, well, yes. Actually, the answer is yes. However, the reason HappySoup doesn't do it is a bit different. So every org has a 24-hour rolling limit of API calls that you can make. The limit depends on the number of users that you have, how much you pay as well, and other things. Like people can buy more API calls essentially if you have a big org with huge integrations. Now, the numbers are usually in the hundred thousands of API calls per rolling 24 hours. So it's not like a block of 24 hours, from today to tomorrow. It's always rolling. So if you make like 100,000 calls in the span of 24 hours, the next call is going to be blocked by Salesforce. Now, HappySoup doesn't make that many calls. And when it comes to reports, in this case, the report API is a very limited API and it only allows calls for individual reports. So I can tell you, I can ask Salesforce, give me the data for all these reports. I need to go one by one. So in this specific scenario, the problem is actually, I think when you, if you have 400 reports, which was one of my cases in my company, and
Yeah.
you make 400 API calls in like, you know, 2 seconds, Salesforce actually starts blocking you because of the rate limit. You're making too many calls. So it's actually Salesforce's load balancer. Their web server starts actually replying back to you with no connection. Um,
Okay.
so it's not the same as you hitting the API limit, is you're making way too many calls in a short span. And I think
Yeah.
Salesforce thinks that it's like some sort of attack or something, and they just block it. So
Yeah.
I actually have an open case with them about that. But so for now, I thought 100 is a reasonable trade-off, right?
No,
I mean,
that's totally fine. Yeah.
yeah, like again, if you have 200, I think that level of granularity, it loses importance if you have so many reports. I think 100 is good enough. Now,
And can't we do the pagination sort of stuff? Just curious actually, whether will that work out? Like you can say, okay, on the first load fetch first 100 reports, and once it's load, then you can click next 100, next 100. That's it.
yeah,
Will that work, or still that comes under the same category?
if you want to go a bit more technical on this, the way I'm doing this behind the scenes is I'm using promise at all. So
Okay.
each call, I'm putting it on a fetch request, and it goes into a promise that all. And because promise that all is in parallel, I think
Yes.
it's just sending like 400 calls to Salesforce in one go. So I think I would need some sort of like debounce function or something so that it just maybe waits a few seconds between each calls. But honestly, I didn't feel that it was that important to
No, no, that's all.
spend
I
that
was
much
just
time.
curious to know.
No,
That's
but
very cool.
it's an interesting problem, and I never thought it would happen. Like building this thing has taught me a lot of things about the Salesforce API and limitations. And yeah, I also didn't think that an org could have more than 500 reports for a single field, but we do. Um, so let me move on a bit here. So one of the things that I was saying earlier is about the ability to understand where an object is used, right? You're a new consultant, you jump into a new company, and they want you to do stuff with the opportunity object, but uh, how is it used? Is it used for quotes? Is it used for deals? Who knows, right? A happy
Okay.
soup can tell you all that, obviously, but it can tell you more or less which metadata relies on the opportunity object, and that can give you a pretty good idea of what you're dealing with. So one of the options here is custom object or custom setting or custom metadata type. The reason I'm putting all these three in one umbrella is because behind the scenes on the Salesforce metadata API, these are all the same. A custom object and a custom metadata type and a custom setting, behind the scenes, it's labeled as custom object. Even though for daily use, it's completely different. For some reason, behind the scenes, it's the same.
Yeah.
So anyway, you go here and you say, okay, what's the object that I care about? Let's say the opportunity object. Um, Suddenly my keyboard stopped working. So here, so you choose here opportunity. So obviously this supports standard and custom objects.
Right.
So I'm gonna see, okay, where is the opportunity used? Now this is one of my sample orgs, so there's gonna be very few things. But as you can see, I immediately can tell that the opportunity object is used in all these Apex classes and one trigger. In a real org, you'll likely find workflow rules, email alerts, email templates, the whole thing. And the idea is that that gives you a sense of, okay, I understand more or less what this company is doing with the opportunity object. And again, the point of all this is that you can make more informed decisions. So like you said earlier, you would run this before you start actually messing with the opportunity object so that you
Right.
know what you're dealing with. And the other scenario that I discussed regarding page layout optimization, let me show you how that works. So you essentially go here to page layout, and we immediately give you the only option, which is show the fields that are used in the page layout. So I'm gonna go here and pull one of the account layouts, just the standard one.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna say, show me the fields on the page layout. And actually, it's a bit misleading because it actually does a bit more than showing the fields. It's just for the sake of simplicity, I omitted that earlier. But it also shows you web links. Web links are actual buttons, like
Yeah.
buttons that you have on the page. And if you had inline Visualforce pages, um, or like, yeah, inline Visualforce pages, that would also show up here. So the idea is that these are all the fields that are used on this page layout. And then you can just come here and copy this to Excel and then literally just drop it there. And then that's what I was saying. Now that you have it here, then you can
Yes.
share this with your business analyst or your product manager, whoever, and then start an exercise of going field by field and determining, do we need it? And you don't lose any of the context from Happy Soup. You can see here by this use by, where is this field used? So it's not, doesn't give you just the fields, it still tells you what is the context that these fields were exported on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Will we get any related list or any other dependent list as well in the page load? The way by using
Mm,
copy to Excel?
no,
Because in
unfortunately
account
not.
I can have notes and attachment or some other things as well in the related list, right? So if I in the page let also will show that. So will it comes here or not?
Unfortunately not, because those things are not, I mean, that's a good point. I think actually now that you mention it, it should, it probably should show that, because those are essentially related objects to the account. So that is a good point, but the main API that Happy Soup relies on actually doesn't provide that information. But since you're asking, there is a Salesforce Apex Metadata API. So there's a new feature that came out like 2 years ago that you can actually inspect page layout metadata directly in Apex. Sorry, this is not the metadata. It's literally in Apex here. So there's a layout class. And I used this a few years ago. So in Apex, you can actually pull one of your page
If you can
layouts.
zoom this as well a little bit,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah.
There, you can in Apex use this layout class, and
Mhm.
essentially you query one of your page layouts, and then you can get more things like the headers, the sections of the page layouts. And I think this related here, related lists. So you could pull
Yes,
the
yes, yeah.
related lists. So this is actually a very nice idea. If Happy Soup was like a native application to Salesforce. Like if it actually run like in a Visualforce page or a Lightning Web component that had access to Apex controllers, then yes, I could actually give you that data, because I could just create an Apex controller that calls that uses the layout class, and then I could tell you which related lists are on that page. That's a great idea. Maybe for the next release.
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
Right. So let me then go back to the slides, because there's one more concept that I want to explain. Um, so there's this concept that Happy Soup is actually pretty good at, but it's a bit tough to explain because it's sort of a new idea, a new concept, or it's more of a new way of imagining the metadata in your org. So the narrative that we've been discussing here is that your org doesn't have clear boundaries of the metadata. And that's why you need Happy Soup, because you need to understand where a field is used. You need to understand what something depends on. Because Salesforce by default doesn't really give you any sort of packaging mechanism or something that you can put modules around things, right? Like not by default, or not in an admin friendly way. So what that results in is that when you're thinking of the metadata of an org, you can usually think about it in like just a bunch of metadata, just a bunch of fields here, a lot of objects, a lot of classes, Lightning Web components, and it's just all thrown in there into this huge pile. And you don't know where things end and where things start. You don't even know if one feature depends on different things, right? Like a
Yeah.
functional feature, a functional business requirement. So what I'm showing here is that normally we would think of the metadata of an org as a bunch of unrelated metadata items here. Now, deployment boundary is when you drill down into one of these top level components. So let's say a workflow email alert. And you realize that the workflow email alert, even though it's a top level component, it actually requires for other metadata to exist before it can function. So for example, the workflow rule is going to have some criteria, and maybe that criteria relies on a formula field. But that formula field, because it's a formula, relies on the values of other fields. And so, it depends on another field. Similarly, the workflow email alert would send out an email template, but that template references fields from maybe a custom object. And so that also depends on that. So once you drill down a bit more, you can actually see that you could draw like a line around that metadata, or you can draw a boundary and say, this is a functional unit of work or of unit of metadata. It's no longer just a bunch of stuff there hanging around. It has a boundary. You could do the exact same thing with a lightning rod component, that it depends on some custom fields, which depend on other fields, and maybe they depend on custom labels as well for some rendering of data. So why is this important, right? Like, why should you care about this? But the reason is that if you can understand more the boundaries between your metadata, it's easier for you to, again, make changes because you know what's impacted. And for companies that are doing advanced development on Salesforce Scratch Orgs or Salesforce Unlocked Packages, they can actually take advantage of this to try to understand where your metadata naturally ends and try to take that into its own package that maybe you can publish as a separate piece of metadata. So again, it's kind of a new, I wouldn't say a new concept, it's just a new way of thinking of how your metadata is grouped.
Yeah, so it's more like you're wrapping something, but you should know what you need to wrap while wrapping the things.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? Yes.
Exactly. And when we spoke the first time, when we met, I was explaining to you that another way of thinking about a deployment boundary, because people will ask, well, why is it called deployment boundary? So this is my org, and my org has this email alert with these custom fields and these email templates. You have your own Trailhead org. Let's say it's brand new, you created it today, it has nothing, it's totally empty. If you were to tell me, Pablo, I want the same workflow email alert, how can I do it in 2 minutes? Well, you can't, because you need to first create the field, you need to create the formulas, you need to create the email template. So you can't just take that email alert and put it in your org in 2 clicks. You need all the stuff that it depends on first. If you had all these 5 items here, all the items below it, if you already had those in your org, then yeah, you could actually create the email alert in just a few seconds because you have everything that you need to be able to deploy it. And that's why I give the name deployment boundary, because it's essentially everything that a top level component needs to exist in another org. That's kind of where the term comes from.
That's really good, actually.
Yeah.
That's very helpful as well. Like if we need something from one org to another org, we'll just come here, see the deployment boundary. We know, okay, these are the stuff we need to wrap it up and send it to other org.
Exactly. Or like I said earlier, if you're an independent consultant and you get asked, can you make changes to this Visualforce page? You've never seen the page. So it will be actually helpful to understand what the page depends on and what those things depend on as well, so that you can maybe spend some time looking at those classes, looking at that logic. And so you actually start from the bottom, looking at that knowledge until you go to the top level Visualforce page. By the time you get there, you understand everything that is going on behind the scenes, and it's going to be easier for you to make changes on that Visualforce page because you understand everything. So let me actually show you an example of what it looks like. I'm going to go back here, and we're going to do it with a Visualforce page. This takes a few seconds. Okay, so let's find this one. And here we're going to choose what it depends on, or again, the deployment boundary. In this one, we'll also give you like a chart so that you can tell, what it depends on the most. So again, we can tell that this Visualforce page depends on 12 custom fields. Now, it's not immediately clear. Does this mean that the page references 12 fields? Or maybe it references something, and that something references maybe 5 fields, and you'll see exactly what I mean by that in a moment. So as you can see here, what I'm showing you here first is that this is your page, or your Visualforce page, and it depends on custom fields, objects, classes, and static resources. So let's open up the first one. It says custom field. Okay, so it depends on these 4 custom fields directly. It means that this Visualforce page has a direct reference to these 4 custom fields. Nothing
Okay.
out of the ordinary. But it also calls an Apex class, probably a controller, like a Visualforce controller. If I open this class, I can see that the class is this select metadata extension, but that class also has its own dependencies. This class depends on yet another set of custom fields. And guess what? Another Apex class. So if I click on this Apex class, there's a new class called the metadata proxy, which again keeps depending on more and more things. And this is exactly what I was saying. If you need to work on this top level component, it will probably be beneficial for you to start learning what this guy here at the bottom does, because you know that whatever this class does affects everything else up the hierarchy,
Right.
right? And so that's the idea, that you start learning about these things bottom to top. And by the time you get here, you sort of understand all the assumptions that this Visualforce page relies on. And
Yeah.
do you have any
And
questions? I'm
this
just going to
this
stop there.
this gives us a even the better view actually, like okay, I should start the debugging from here to the top. Okay, this is where it is. Otherwise, like my personal problem in real time, like if I am new to a project and I don't know like from where to start, I'll go search the field, then I'll get bunch of the custom fields or Apex classes, and I'll go and make the reference myself. Okay, this is called from here, this called from here. I'll come hit here directly. I know, okay, this is called from this parent. This parent has another parent. It's pretty good, pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. I did see, like every time I speak to someone about this, they come up with a new use case. I never thought of debugging, but yeah, that makes sense. If you're debugging some issue, you maybe you don't have to start at the bottom, but just knowing that there's way more, than meet the eye, then
Yes.
it is definitely very beneficial. Um, so then you can expand this whole thing, right? If I want to go here and say expand all, then you would see the entire sort of tree of dependencies. And so if we go back to the concept of a deployment boundary, if you wanted, again, Pablo, can you give me this page, this Visualforce page? You would have to take everything that is here, retrieve it from my org, deploy it, and only then you could actually create this page, this Visualforce page in your org. Now, a nice feature is that if you go back here and you copy this to Excel, and I'm gonna zoom this as well. Let me expand this a bit. Is that, so now again, you're seeing everything that, let me make this bigger. Is that good enough?
Yeah, it's all right. So it's a flat view basically.
Yeah, it's a flat view, but not entirely. The use by still keeps the context of what was the relationship that you had to navigate to end up on this field. Because if I give you a flat view and you look at all these custom fields, it's not clear. Are these custom fields being used directly, or are they being used via something else, in the middle? And so this use by is telling you that this field, for example, is used by the top level component via this other field right here. And so you
Yeah,
still don't lose the entire context. You understand more or less what led to that field being on the screen.
correct.
And then the last thing is, right, that we've been saying about retrieving these and deploying it. How do you actually do that? There's a package XML button here. So if you click on that, that's going to automatically generate a package XML for you, which is what you can use to, let me indent that. This is what you can use with the metadata API, like the Ant migration toolkit or with Salesforce DX to do a metadata retrieve. And this would
Yeah,
actually export all this metadata, including, of course, the top level component. So this is exactly how, if you want to take this out of my org, I will get this package, retrieve it, and then the package that I retrieve, you can immediately deploy it in your org because it has all the dependent metadata, including the top level component.
right,
So it's all
right.
there.
That's
So
really amazing. So it covers all sort of metadata, right? Like whether it's a static resources, custom label, which all dependencies are there for that particular package. It
mm,
covers everything.
most stuff. So Happy Soup relies heavily on this API called the Metadata Component Dependency. This is actually in beta, but it's been in beta for like 2 years, so it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
The product manager told me that it's not going to go away, but it's essentially an object in the REST API or the tooling REST API that exposes like the metadata component name and reference metadata. So this is the API that is at the core of Happy Soup. So because it's still in beta, it doesn't support everything. There are some things that you wouldn't, that the API wouldn't actually show you, even though those dependencies exist in the org. A good example of that is that actually that API doesn't show you if a field is used um, in a workflow rule or a workflow field update. However, HappySoup does show that. And the only reason HappySoup does that, even though the API doesn't, is because I have manually implemented logic to go and find those dependencies by using different APIs and trying to find a reference to a field. So like 2 weeks, if we had had this conversation 2 weeks ago, these two
Yeah.
nodes wouldn't be here because I hadn't realized that the API didn't support them. And so I had to build it myself by, again, calling different APIs, looking at the metadata of these workflow rules and seeing if they actually reference the field in question. So it doesn't support everything, but at least Happy Soup supports more than if you were to use the API raw.
Cool.
So I think
That's really awesome.
that's it. That those are really the main use cases of Happy Soup. One nice bonus that I forgot to show is that if you're working with a lot of sunlight, you can change to this light theme, and then it all
Okay, the
becomes
theming
white.
is there.
Yeah, it's here. So this one is called the Workbench theme, and the original is called the Happy Soup theme.
Okay, and that's really nice. That's really good.
Yeah.
No, it was really good tool, and I have few questions. We'll talk about that. Like from where you get this idea to build Happy Soup, basically.
Yeah, to be entirely honest, it came out of imposter syndrome because I would consider myself to be actually very good in all things Salesforce, but I didn't know much about how to build stuff in another platform. Like I knew JavaScript, but like very basic stuff that I had done here and there. But if you ask me, can you create a new tool in JavaScript end to end with front end, back end, queuing systems, deployment, I just couldn't. And because Salesforce has been releasing more JavaScript based development with Lightning Web Components and all that, I sort of started to feel like, I should know more. I shouldn't be just a Salesforce guy. And not that there's anything wrong with that, because I've been a Salesforce guy for
Yeah.
almost 10 years. But yeah, I just felt like I should be able to do more, and I want to be able to do more. Like I've seen other people that they can do more. So it actually started with, again, purely being honest, pure imposter syndrome that I felt like I don't know enough and I want to learn more and I want to become better. And so I started doing some training courses on Coursera, on YouTube, and initially I knew I wanted to build some app to visualize dependencies because I knew about that API, but I didn't know that it was going to end up being Happy Soup. I was thinking maybe it was going to be like a Chrome extension or maybe something like that. But as I started to keep thinking about the idea, I realized the best thing would be like a whole full stack applications that so that I'm forced to learn the entire end-to-end implementation of a typical web app. And that took about 11 months or 10 to 11 months between learning and building it. And to be honest, sometimes I'm still surprised that it works. Like,
That's a really amazing tool you build actually. As a JavaScript developer, I never built this sort of cool stuff. And that's really awesome. So How much time did you take to complete till here right now? I know you are continuously evolving or adding some new features. So, but till to this point, how much time you take to build this awesome tool?
Yeah, I would say to what you're seeing right now, 11 months, or no, sorry, like 10 months. Yeah, 10 months really is what it took. Um, and I started with just putting together the API, like behind the scenes, like the core API that looks at the dependencies and does all that stuff. I started with that, with nothing else, no front end, no Express, no queuing system. Literally, it's just a JavaScript file that if you pass a Salesforce username and password, it logs in, and then it starts looking at the dependencies. And I started to add things on top of it later on. Um, Also, I spent a lot of time doing like R&D, like just research, like because what you see here actually looks very simple, right? You click a button and well, suddenly the dependencies are there, but there's actually a lot of limitations on the API that I didn't cover that I'm actually bypassing. And I remember one morning I actually had to go to my backyard with a notebook and a pen and just sit down and write down like sort of the algorithm to crack it because I just couldn't figure it out, and I had to step away from the computer and just write it down and try to understand what would be the logical flow for this thing to work. And so it was very hard, especially because I had never done anything like this. If you ask me to do it again, it will probably take me half the time, but it was tough, to be honest. But it's very satisfying. Somebody asked me the other day if I'm satisfied. Did I achieve my goal? And I would say, yeah, 100%. Especially because I'm getting nice feedback. Because let's be honest, nobody wants to build something if nobody's gonna use it, right? Like if I
Right.
if I if I put this out there and there were zero logins in 6 months, let's be honest, right? Nobody would feel happy about that. So uh,
Exactly.
the fact that so many people have reached out and told me, hey, this is great, this is super useful, it's really amazing, has given me a really good amount of satisfaction.
No, that's really good. So, in this 11-month journey, did you get any contributor to your GitHub? Like any people are raising any issues or any support while enhancing your code or something? Did you get any of them? Like,
No, and I think there are a few reasons for that. First is it's a highly, I mean, it is a complex app because it has the whole front end, the whole back end, and there's a whole bunch of code for the queuing framework. So there's a queuing system behind the scenes that takes a job and then puts it on a worker. And so there's a lot of infrastructure there. And what I think is it's not easy for people to tell what is the entry point of all this stuff, right? Every application has some sort of main, right? Entry point, and
yes,
then you
yes,
start from there. It's not clear because there are way too many files, too many JavaScript files. And so even if it was me and you gave me this and I've never seen it, I would have no idea to understand, how do I start putting features on top of this. So one of the things that I wanted to do in the future, and maybe with someone like yourself, is to actually have like a video where I explain the architecture and, like an open source sort of handbook. Like, okay, if you want to contribute to Happy Soup, you need to know these things about the architecture, about the entry points, and about the design patterns. Because honestly, I think if you don't know that, it's almost impossible for someone to contribute. I myself wonder. I don't know if you've had experience contributing to open source projects, but I don't know how
yeah.
people do it because you need to understand a lot to be able to contribute a change.
Yes, no, actually, there is a term like Hacktoberfest. Every year they conduct. It's done by Digital Ocean and the Free Code Camp and all. So every year in the month of October, they promote the people to contribute to open source. So I do every year for
Oh,
that, like
nice.
around like 4 to 8 open source contributions. So it's pretty interesting. It's not hard, but yeah, it's important to learn how to start actually. Like what's the entry point basically? Like it's you need to know how I can use Git for open source. Like how
Yeah,
I should not spoil others repo directly. I should know how to write the proper comments, how I can fork the library, and how can I add my own like logic, and then I can validate all the stuff, not my own code but the whole app in one go. So it's pretty
Yeah.
good actually in open source stuff. And I have seen very less people who are contributing in open source from Salesforce end, because if somebody else would have built this sort of tool, they would have go for the app exchange and selling this sort of
Yeah,
tool.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's another thing. I think the open source community in Salesforce is still pretty new. Like it's there are a few open source projects there, and I do see some people contributing here and there, but those are mostly like Apex based frameworks. You know, maybe like a trigger framework or something like that. But for a big project like this, I think it's still pretty new. And even myself, like if I were to see a similar project, I wouldn't know how to start, like, you know. And I think there's also a lot of overhead, but like you mentioned, a lot of knowledge on how do you clone the Git repo, how do you fork it, how do you make sure that you're pulling the latest so that you don't override someone's changes. And even after this 10 months journey, I would, to be honest, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that because I actually have never done it. So and that's not something that you would normally do as a Salesforce developer. So it's not like a native skill that you're gonna find on the market, and
Right.
I think that that's a challenge.
No, that's absolutely true. Like, but yeah, it's always good, or you feel good like you are contributing to some big open source, even though people like developers do to the full React library, Facebook, Google, like open source contribution towards machine learning is going very huge nowadays. Like, it's really amazing. And I hope like after this video, many people will talk about Happy Soup they'll use in their real time, and yeah, the contribution will come to your platform soon.
That would be great because honestly, sometimes it also takes a lot of my time. Like it's almost
Yeah.
like another job. Like
No,
you
yeah,
know,
obviously, you need to keep up and running this task as well as your day-to-day task.
yeah. So I wouldn't mind like I think now it has reached a state where it's pretty stable. Like it has a good amount of features. Not it doesn't do crazy amount of things, but it also doesn't do too little. It's like on a sweet spot that it's good enough. So sometimes I feel like I could just leave it there and just don't touch it for a few months, and I wouldn't mind people actually sort of taking more ownership and putting new features. That would be great. Like that would be ideal because then I wouldn't need to do anything. I would just sit there and see people building features on top of it. But I think that's probably a few years away.
Yeah, no, but it gives us a good learning as well. Like if we, I have seen your code and you have used very good practices as well. It's not like by seeing the code, I can't say like you just learned the JavaScript 11 months before, but it's looked like a master JavaScript developer is writing some code with the full design pattern and like how you structure the classes and all those stuff. It's pretty amazing.
Oh, well, that means a lot. Thanks for that. I would probably attribute that to the fact that I've been doing Apex before, so I think a lot of the patterns sort of translate, especially around clean code, right? Because you could use all the patterns, but if your variable names are horrible and if your method names don't make sense, and if you have a bunch of magic numbers, you know, x plus y equals one, then yeah. So I think my passion is more around making the code very easy to read, and I think that's why you probably find it. I guess professional. It's because I put a lot of effort in making sure that the names make sense. And to be honest, sometimes I even spend like 10 minutes just thinking, you know, what should I name this thing? And and it's so stupid. Like sometimes you know it should just be, you know, do or run or execute. But sometimes I get stuck in this thing, like, you know, I wanted to have a name that people can immediately know what it does. And sometimes I get stuck on that.
In JavaScript, I recently learned one naming convention. Like, suppose you're short of your variable's name, right? And you are using a parent-child relationship between the component, one component dependent on another one. So if you're using, suppose table data is a variable name. So if you're using the same variable inside the another component, you can use underscore table data, or like
Mm,
you can append underscore in front of them. So underscore will represent the local variable and the table data will represent the global variable, something like that. That was a
mm.
pretty cool trick actually, just append, because in variable you can append underscore in the front in JavaScript
Yeah,
especially.
yeah, yeah.
So that's I learned recently only, like, okay, this is a cool trick instead of giving like table data one, table data two sort of.
Yeah, no, no,
Super
that is
exciting.
interesting, and that's also one of the flexibilities of JavaScript is that you have more, I guess, flexibilities in terms of that. You can even use like jQuery, right? You can use the dollar sign for a variable name, right? Which you wouldn't be able to do in other languages.
Correct.
But anyway, I think this was a great talk, and I really appreciate your time. Yeah, I really
Thank you so much.
enjoyed this conversation, and I think this was a good overview of Happy Soup. So I hope whoever's watching this, has learned about it. And like I said, it's just happysoup.io. And if anyone has feedback or any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Yes, and the guys who are watching, they can raise the issues if you find like if you want to improve something in the GitHub, there is a issues tab. You can go and you can suggest something you want to add because this gives this tool to grow more. We'll get an idea, okay, what else we can improve. And if you're facing some actual issue like something is not working correctly, that also you can raise there. And yeah, thanks Pablo for supporting the open source community as well as the Salesforce with this awesome tool. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, yeah, no problem.